Welcome to the Exploring the Core podcast. I'm your host, Greg Mullen. In this fifth episode, I continue my exploration of values with a focus on trust as a value. And I want to know whether more trust in a teacher-student relationship will result in more learning. And more on that later, because I want to quickly revisit what values are, because it isn't one single behavior that defines a value. Instead, a value represents an ideal. They give us a way to reflect not only on our behaviors, but our expectations for behaviors in different contexts and situations. I share in the last episode how responsibility looks at different behaviors focused on ownership and accountability. We want people to take care of their things, to keep shared spaces neat and organized, and for students to take ownership and be held accountable for their decisions toward learning. I also share about respect as a value, looking at behaviors that have to do with authority and self-worth. We want people to recognize their self-worth in context of a relationship's balance of authority and how much we're willing to let one person make decisions for another. And today, as I look at the value of trust, I want to point out that trust isn't as easy to see like it is with respect and responsibility. We can see someone act irresponsibly. We can see a person act disrespectfully, but distrustful behavior is not always as easy to observe. This is because trust in a person is a belief that we form in our minds when we see in someone three specific things: competence, reliability, and care. To trust someone is to recognize that they know what they're talking about, that's competence, that we can rely on them in both their words and their actions, that's the reliability, and that their words and actions reflect an interest in what we think and do, that's caring. Now, we don't need all three things to have trust. A student might trust their teacher for their academic competence and trust that they'll show up to the classroom every day. But maybe they don't trust them enough to approach their teacher with challenges, academic or otherwise, and maybe they don't have to. That degree of trust may be enough for that student to learn from that teacher. But would more trust result in more learning? Well, that's where I want to start exploring this core value of trust in a learning environment. And to help explore this value, I'll be sharing insights from two amazing individuals, each with their own unique perspective on trust and learning. The first is Doug Thompson, a graduate student in pursuit of a medical degree, but also a physical therapist assistant, as well as an assistant coach at his local high school, where trust plays a big role in the kinds of relationships he develops. Then in the second half of this episode, I introduce Allison Dillard, author and host of the podcast Allison Loves Math. She's a community college math professor and teaches remedial math courses for students who did graduate from high school but aren't quite ready for community college level math courses. And she has some interesting thoughts on trust and learning. So stick around as we explore this core value of trust as one more layer to this larger season-long exploration of who we are and how we learn. Doug Thompson has a wide range of experience coaching and assisting people in learning about themselves and their capacity to succeed. Not only has Doug spent years coaching high school football, he has spent years as a physical therapist aide and is now studying in the Azusa Pacific Doctor of Physical Therapy program with a focus on orthopedics. I talked to him about his experiences growing up and the role this value of trust has played in his life. Specifically, I asked him about his thoughts on this value's three aspects of competency, reliability, and caring.
Let's start at the beginning. Competence. Hey, do I know what I'm talking about? That's the very bare minimum you expect out of your doctor is, do they know what they're talking about? So that one's pretty self-explanatory, because if I didn't care how much I liked a doctor. If he didn't know what he was doing, I would not go back to him. No
Yeah.
if, ands, or buts. The reliability aspect. Fortunately, in the physical therapy world, we see our patients relatively frequently, anywhere from every day to once a month to maybe a couple times a year, like depending. Typically, it's going to be anywhere from a couple times a week to every other week is the typical range you'll see in a lot of physical therapy settings. And being in that setting, so you're reliable just on the fact that, hey, every day you come in, I'm going to be there and be able to help you. So as long as they continuously see your face and you continuously preach the same message, they understand that reliability. And then the last one was caring. Physical therapy is it has therapist built into its title. You're one of the few medical professionals people sit down with for an extended period of time over an extended period of time. So say I get 30 minutes with you 3 times a week. That's the most you've seen your medical doctor in a year. I've always done my best in that setting to remember names. I always struggle with that too. And then from there, just kind of build off some sort of small relationship factor, whether it's a sports team, whether it's a child, whether it's a shared personal experience. Find something that I share with my patient so that way I can empathize with them a little bit more and create a relationship to where they understand, hey, at the end of the day, I'm here for you. When you build that kind of trust from your patients, the buy-in is exponential. So, and that's the biggest thing with physical therapy is how much is your patient going to buy into what you have to say?
Do you think this applies to your experiences as a football coach assistant?
Oh, absolutely. Big thing is again, going back through it, the competency, like, hey, do I know what I'm talking about? Like that's the bare minimum. I've had coaches in my past that didn't know what they were talking about and I never listened to them. Then you get the reliability. Like over the 7 years I coach, I could count on 2 hands how many practices I missed. And that's big for kids to see that kind of reliability of, hey, every day I'm going to be here and I'm going to preach the same message to you every day. I may not always have the same mood. I might have had a bad day, but at the end of the day, I'm here for you. And then that third thing, the caring. If you get to really know a kid, now it's tough because a lot of times kids don't want to open up to you. And I've had that where I've tried to, there's very clearly issues going on with a kid, either at home or at school. And you try and get them to open up and they just refuse. But just simply being there for that kid is huge because like a lot of times, like if I know a kid's got something going on, I give them my phone number. Like, hey, if you ever need anything, shoot me a text. I'm there for you. If they know you're there for them, they're going to buy into what you have to say. And like you said, just building that trust is really how you get the best out of people because then you get a mutual relationship to want to do well for each other.
Part of my conversation with Doug explored where this perspective towards trust comes from. As a physical therapist, whether it developed coaching football or if it stems from something earlier as a student growing up. One of the things that fascinates me about Doug's perspective is that we know we want patients to trust their doctors. We want football players to trust their coaches. We want students to trust their teachers. And I asked Doug about this, is there something about his growing up that led him to this understanding? Did he always have this confidence in himself to put trust in others and know how to build trust at an early age?
For me, growing up when I was in middle school, early high school, my just natural confidence levels were very low. Like I had pretty low self-esteem. Like I knew I was smart, but that was about it. I didn't have a ton of confidence in anything else. And once I understood, it's like, oh, I'm really good at something. And I started being able to share that. It helped my confidence levels rise and it helped me in other areas as well. So being able to, because a lot of times you'll have these kids who are afraid of failing. And so they're not putting forward the effort that they necessarily need. Now, if you give them the confidence to be able to teach this subject again by themselves, not only is it going to strengthen their understanding of it, but it's also going to open them up to be willing to ask more questions and learn better as well.
Something Doug hits on here really piques my interest because what I heard was how it wasn't any one person who built this perspective toward trust in him, but that he somehow built this perspective toward trust in himself, When we think of relationships, we think of them in pairs: parent-child, teacher-student, doctor-patient. But how often do we think of these three components of competency, reliability, and caring in context of the relationship we build with ourself? I explored this idea with Doug by asking him whether his idea, expecting students to teach a topic to strengthen their understanding, which opens them up to ask more questions and learn more, whether this applies only when a student is already interested, or if he thinks this applies to topics they might not be interested in yet and are being perhaps coerced into learning.
I think it helps create an interest because everybody likes the things they're good at the end of the day. There's a reason why athletic kids love sports. There's a reason why gifted musical kids love music. And a lot of times that doesn't interact. So if you create the confidence in something that you're good at something, I feel like that in the long run is going to help kids create an interest because I like what I'm good at. So let's create these systems in where these kids can create their own desires through their own competence, essentially.
My conversation with Doug branched into a variety of fascinating topics, but in context of trust as a value, I was fascinated by the idea that we could build trust in ourselves by focusing on our interests, which is a big part of the self-directed learning side of the education coin. It got me thinking how educators in a conventional schooling system might be able to create this kind of environment that promotes this level of trust, not just in the teacher-student relationship, but in the student's relationship with their own competence, their own reliability, their own capacity to care for themselves. And this brings me to a different side of this idea of trust as a value. And remember, a value is an ideal, a way to reflect on behaviors in different contexts and situations, where trust as a value is a belief when we see in someone, even ourselves, these three things of competence, reliability, and care. If we do not believe ourselves to be competent, if we can't rely on ourselves, if we do not take the time to care about our own words and actions, what kind of anxiety does this create? And what might this anxiety look like, say, in high school graduates who are surprised to have to enroll in remedial math classes at the community college? And that's where I want to introduce Allison Dillard, a community college professor who sees this kind of anxiety in the high school graduates who show up to her community college classes and who have a particular mindset about their own learning. Allison Dillard is a community college math professor at Irvine Valley College in Irvine, California. Allison's taught classes that specifically address students who have had to enroll in remedial and co-requisite entry-level math courses. And she has a pretty good idea of the kind of anxiety towards learning that can develop in students, which I think she describes really well.
So my perspective from Irvine Valley College is that I teach more of the remedial math classes. So for example, I taught college algebra in the spring. It's a transfer level math course, right? It, transfers to any of the four-year colleges, but I was teaching it with what they call co-requisite support, which means that technically the students who are in the class didn't either have the grades necessarily to qualify for that class. And so they gave us an extra 2 units on the side to learn the prerequisite skills that they need for that class. So I was working more so with students who were not necessarily prepared for the college level math classes. So I'll just preface what I'm saying by saying that those are the students that I'm working with, which is a different group of students than, say, those who are just placed immediately into calculus and they're prepared for it, and then they go on and take calculus 2 and 3. That's a different set of students who are at the community college. What I found was I had a lot of students with math anxiety. I have a lot of students who did not have strong math foundations, and a lot of students who honestly didn't like math and didn't want to learn math and just wanted to be told, this is what I do, tell me exactly how I do it so I don't have to think about it. And if I can just regurgitate things and pass, then I'm really, really happy. So good students who their hearts are in the right places and they want to do well and they want to succeed, but that would be probably the best description of the students who are placing into those classes that had the remedial math support.
With a better sense of the kind of student Allison is teaching, it isn't too difficult to connect this to the conversation about this value of trust and the kind of anxiety that can develop in students if this trust isn't developed. And not just in the teacher-student relationship and the trust that develops there, but in the student's relationship and trust in themselves. Because, and I'm excited to talk about this, one of the things Allison has started doing this past year is hosting her own podcast. It's called Allison Loves Math, and she speaks to all kinds of different professionals related to education. One of those professionals is Maria Ryan, who holds a PhD in education with a focus on math anxiety. And so I asked Allison about what she took away from their conversation.
I was actually just talking with the math professor. Her name's Maria Ryan, and she's a math professor with a PhD in math anxiety. So she's actually done PhD work, and she's working on publishing some papers now on math anxiety as well. So I was talking with her the other day, and so I think she's working on a paper now that is talking about how identifying the sort of root cause of math anxiety can help students to overcome it. It was something that we talked about on the podcast episode, and I love. She's writing a paper about it now, and she's doing research, talking with different people about it. I think that was something that was just very interesting, because I think so often students they think that they're bad at math, and some students are brilliant at it and some aren't. It's almost like they think it's magic. It's like in Harry Potter's got the magic, and then there's the rest of us who are just regular people. But I think when you identify that experience, right, or maybe that teacher who told you were bad at math, or maybe it was a parent or a friend, or it was just a really bad test that you just never recovered from, whatever that one experience was that kind of started you down that path of math anxiety. Once you recognize it, then you sort of realize that it's not who you are. You're not necessarily defined as a person who has math anxiety, and it'll never go away. It helps you to realize that, this is just, there was an experience that sort of shaped who I am right now, but I can overcome that, right? And obviously in different experiences and different conversations and interacting with different people can all change that. That was something that I thought was really interesting, because I think I'd had so many conversations with students about that over the years, but I never realized that was something that was being researched, as a game changer for students with math anxiety.
As our conversation headed in this direction of students with anxiety towards math and towards school, I want to pause to make this connection that when we don't believe we have competence in something, we do not trust ourselves as much as we might be able to. And as Doug mentioned earlier in this episode, that trust in our own competence creates interest. I wanted to know more about Allison's approach to teaching, given her awareness of this value of trust that's involved in teaching and learning. I asked about her thoughts on whether she believes her approach toward building this trust was something that was intentional or intuitive in her style of teaching.
My background before I was a teacher was that I was a math tutor. So I started tutoring math in high school. It was my part-time job through college. After college, I did it for years. And I think it was really, really helpful in that sense when it comes with, math anxiety and all of this mindset stuff, because as a math tutor, I was always working with the students who were struggling in math. Obviously, that's why they needed a math tutor. And I found that, it didn't matter how you explain a concept to a student. If they're in the wrong mindset, it just goes right over their head. They just ignore everything. They literally just block it out and say, oh, I can't understand it. But if they're in the right mindset, honestly, you can do a crappier job of explaining the math concept and they'll get it. And so it was really weird, because I had these years of math tutoring, which ultimately was just me working one-on-one with students with with their mindset. I think, honestly, I think back to those years, and I think that was the biggest thing that helped so many of my students. And it was like all the parents that I worked with, they're like, oh, you're so good at explaining math. And I was, in retrospect, I'm just like, no, I think I got your kid to believe that they were able to do it. And then the rest of it just took off from there. And that was a huge challenge for me when I moved into teaching, was because I was so used to being able to, have this positive effect on students one-on-one. And then all of a sudden you're in a class of 40 students. Of my biggest class had 75 students, and it's very hard to have that do the same thing in a large class. And so then once I started teaching, basically that was what I started experimenting with, was, well, how do I take what I was doing one-on-one and do that for 40 students instead of just one student? And, it's a challenge, but at the same time, I'm like, that's kind of cool. If I could do that, right? That's so much more, I can impact so many more students than I could back when I was tutoring,
I'm on the edge of my seat wondering what you did to figure it out.
No, I think I'm still working on it. I think like anything, it's a constant challenge, but, I think that, I don't know, so much of the stuff that we're talking about, it's just lots of little things. And, I've interviewed a few other teachers who are doing a great job at it, on my podcast. And I interviewed Dennis Sheeran, who wrote Instantly Relevant, and so he wrote an entire book on how to make math relevant for students and how that engages them and gets them going and learning math, as long as you can find that way to get them to be interested in it. And I interviewed actually the head of my math department at my school, because honestly, he is somebody who has, all of the math classes will be open and he's got a wait list of like 70 students for his classes. So I was like, I need to find out what you're doing, and he was talking just about how, he gets his students understand that he cares about their success. And it's not a teacher-student relationship. It's we're all on the same team trying to figure this hard stuff out, and so it's sort of flipping that sort of student-professor relationship around, so students know that they're in this safe place where they can ask questions, where their teacher's not against them, but working with them. There's so many different little things.
With everything Allison has done in her tutoring, in her teaching at the community college level, and with everything she's learning from others through her podcast, it got me thinking about how students connect with Allison, how they develop that respect and that responsibility and ownership for their learning, and how that trust between her and her students translated to the next class with the next teacher. I was curious about her thoughts on how a school might help students to not rely solely on this trust in the professor-student relationship, and perhaps focus the students' attention on what they themselves can control to build that trust in themselves in case the professor-student relationship just isn't there for a particular student.
I think that's such an important question, because I did find that early on, I was really focused on getting students to be successful in my class, right? And so I did all these things, I got them to like math, I got them to, have that growth mindset and feel encouraged and motivated and all of that stuff. And then I had a student come back and say, oh, you know what? I dropped out of the next level of math, but now I'm going to take it with you, so it'll be okay. Because the other teacher, he wasn't good. He wasn't interesting. He was, too hard. And I was like, oh, that was not my goal. That was not my goal. And so I do really focus on basically what your question is, right? How obviously step one is to get them through your own class, right? But if you're not setting them up for success in the next class, you're doing them a disservice.
This focus on developing a student's trust in themselves to develop that sense of competence, of reliability, of caring, that this role of the teacher is not strictly academic focused, that our role is to identify, assess, and engage students to develop their own sense of values toward opportunities for learning that teachers are offering, their authority as a learner, their ownership of their learning, and their trust in themselves. The way we talk about education often sees these aspects of the classroom as a separate course of study, as a 30-minute, twice a week scheduled lesson on social and emotional competencies. But what I get from this conversation with Allison is that our role as educators is not just to instruct academics with a side of social awareness and emotional intelligence. Our role as educators is to help students learn how to learn, and not just about academics, but how to learn about themselves in order to improve their capacity for learning academic topics at any age. And I ask Allison about this kind of growth mindset aspect of teaching and learning, and about her thoughts on our role as educators, the beliefs we tell ourselves, and how often we see ourselves as math teachers rather than psychologists.
Is that one of the hardest things about math education, though, right? Is that anybody who's teaching math, our background, our area of expertise is math, right? None of the psychology stuff, which is so incredibly helpful for students to succeed in math, none of that's actually taught to us, in school. And I take that back. That could just be me coming from the master's in math where it was strictly math, right? I suppose if you have a master's in education, hopefully there's a lot more of that, but for someone like me at the community college where I just come from a straight math background, I've never taken a class on any of that psychology and mindset stuff that is so helpful for math.
There was one more question I had about this idea with regards to building in students this sense of trust in themselves. And it's how there seems to be this consistent obstacle in the way of getting teachers and students to see this value as something they can work toward. I mentioned to Allison that since we as humans, as students, we are not machines, and we know that there's so much material in any one course or class. So with everything else going on in our lives, it's reasonable to acknowledge how hard it is to have 100% mastery of every single concept with retention for every student in any classroom. Managing this expectation for self-competency is important and is a very difficult thing to discuss. How at the end of a course, we might reasonably expect that most students are going to get most of the material, and that would be considered a success. But then when they go to the next course or class with those gaps, if they go in knowing that those gaps are a reasonable expectation, then, and it's this that I ask Allison about, if the students know what the gaps are, so when they go to the next course and they know that those gaps are partly responsible for the challenges they'll face in the next more complex course at her college, is there anything that can be done to help students with this sense of self-awareness and self-management for their own learning?
Probably depends on the student, right? I think some students are more self-aware than others are. I think there's some students who come out of classes saying, you know what, I know that really well, but I know that I don't know this other stuff really well. And I think there's other students who go, you know what, I passed, therefore I must be good enough and everything. And it all sort of, and I don't think they necessarily think about things that way. And I think that is something that I struggle with students who are placed into these classes with co-requisite support, is that, they don't, I don't know, I feel like I see students who they get to college and they've maybe been passed through all of their math classes. So they've passed all of them, but somehow they managed to not learn very much through 4 years of math, or through, K through 12. And it's hard because they don't know very much. And it's because they don't have that self-awareness to recognize that they're not learning certain things. And so that's very difficult. And that's a hard conversation to have with students when they say, but I was always a B math student. And I have to say, but you don't know anything that you need for this class. And it's okay. You can learn it. This is a 7-unit class because we've got those extra 2 units to learn the stuff that you don't know. So you can, but you have to recognize a 7-unit class is a lot of work, and you have to delegate your time appropriately so you can learn those things that you need as you need them. So that's a hard conversation with students sometimes, but it's better to be honest. I think I feel like, there's students who I don't know, you have to be honest. When they're up against a lot, they need to know what it is so they can do the work necessary.
When I think of Allison's perspective and insights in context of this episode's focus on the value of trust, I think with students who are coming from a high school setting, who maybe had minor learning gaps from elementary school with maybe something like fractions, then in middle school had those gaps widen a bit with ratios and proportionality, and then maybe hitting a wall as they entered high school with slope, geometric functions, statistical analyses. It makes me think about the trust these students have developed in themselves because of that relentless annual schedule of learning where 60 or 70% moves a person through those courses. And each year, that missing 30 or 40% that's not learned compounds until they find themselves in Allison's classroom, where they realize that their beliefs about their competence in math, their beliefs toward their own reliability to perform consistently well, and the care with which they learn to treat themselves as Allison coaches them, not only on the math, but on learning how to learn. It makes me think about how often we as teachers assume students are receiving that kind of personalized attention toward this layer of values, of ideals, of expectations for behaviors, and how this system we've created for academic success, measuring and enforcing an annual schedule of academic expectations, might need an overhaul that refocuses attention on creating that trust, that respect, that responsibility for both teaching and learning. Because we can't forget that teachers are a product of this same system we're talking about. So as we explore this core layer of values and think about how it feeds the outer layer, the elements of a learning environment that I describe in episode 3, we get closer to creating a shared language and a shared understanding of these values and what they mean for us as individuals, for us in our different relationships, and for us in our communities, both big and small. And in the next episode, I explore how we develop these kinds of social and emotional competencies that feed this capacity for addressing the kinds of values I've shared in this episode and the last. These SEL, social and emotional learning competencies, such as managing emotions, developing communication skills, and recognizing our value as responsible members of our various communities. This focus on self, social, and societal awareness and management is a deeper layer in my exploration of who we are and how we learn. Now, as I bring this 5th episode to a close, I want to once again revisit this 2nd season's introductory episode where I talk about capturing a rainbow. These values are not in themselves an exploration for who we are and how we learn. The topics and all of the people throughout this 2nd season, they're all part of the environment responsible for that metaphorical rainbow I described in that introductory episode. And the question to ask is not how this episode answers all our questions about who we are and how we learn, but how these ideas connect with the ideas in the other episodes to help you come to a conclusion that's meaningful to you and your community. So I hope you're enjoying this 2nd season of episodes, and I thank you for listening. Talk to you next time.